Good day. Today, 30th October, is the first day when we perhaps are starting to see the first signs of a slight cooling of the temperature in the Middle East crisis. Now, this, of course, follows directly upon that vote in the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly, which marked a diplomatic defeat for the United States, and with clear signs that the mood in the Middle East, the current of opinion, not just in the Middle East, but around the world, was running strongly against an all-out attack on Gaza, ideas of displacing the population from Gaza, expanding the war to include Iran, and of course was also increasingly demanding a ceasefire of in relation to the fighting in Gaza. So the United States, perhaps aware of the extent of global opposition to perhaps the more radical policies that it has been taking up to this present time, is perhaps now starting to signal that it and its ally Israel are reining back, at least to some degree. Firstly, we've had an article in the New York Times which says that the United States has persuaded Israel not to seek and not to pursue an all-out assault upon Gaza, to approach this in a gradual, incremental way, attacking Hamas positions where they can be identified, launching strikes against bunkers and tunnels and that kind of thing. And this is, of course, consistent with the kind of military actions that Israel has actually been taking in Gaza that I'm going to come to briefly. But anyway, we have the New York Times actually telling us that this is the advice that the United States has been giving, and that it is the policy that Israel, the actual military policy that Israel is following. But perhaps the clearest sign of a moderation in the US position is provided by the White House readout of a telephone conversation that President Biden has just had with the President of Egypt, President Al-Sisi. And I'm going to read this readout in full because of the somewhat more measured language, some more balanced language that we have seen, we find in it, and also because of certain statements which it makes, which seem to me not only to go beyond statements that the United States has itself made in the past, but which clearly show an awareness of Egyptian and Arab positions, and which appears to be making some effort to meet those positions. So this is what the readout says, and this is a conversation which took place between Al-Sisi and President Biden yesterday. President Biden spoke today with President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt to express his appreciation for Egypt's leading role in efforts to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance to the civilian population of Gaza. The two leaders committed to the significant acceleration and increase of assistance flowing into Gaza beginning today and then continuously. They also discussed the importance of protecting civilian lives, respect for international humanitarian law, and ensuring that Palestinians in Gaza are not displaced to Egypt or any other nation. Now let's take a step back and just pass this readout. And this is a White House readout. White House readouts tend to be rather terse and uninformative, but not in this case. And seeing all of this in a White House readout is, of course, is communicating information about US intentions to all Arab governments, whose foreign ministers, of course, will be reading this readout, and to the foreign ministries of the major powers, Russia, China, Iran, and others, and of course, around the world. So first of all, we have Biden expressing appreciation for Egypt's leading role in efforts to facilitate delivery of humanitarian assistance to the civilian population of Gaza. And we see that he has committed himself and the United States to supporting Egyptian efforts to significantly accelerate and increase the assistance flowing into Gaza, beginning today, that's the 29th of October, and then continuously. Well, of course, what this readout doesn't mention is that last week and before, the Egyptians and UN humanitarian agencies and other relief agencies were trying to deliver humanitarian aid into Gaza, and they were finding the crossing points which are controlled by Israel, being closed to them. The Israelis were at that time insisting that the crossing points be opened to allow Gaza residents to leave Gaza and to flow into Egypt. They were saying that they would keep the crossing points closed unless and until the Egyptians agreed to allow people from Gaza to enter Egypt in that kind of way. And the Egyptians, by contrast, were insisting that they would not allow a mass exodus of people from Gaza into Egypt. The only purpose upon which they wanted the crossing points opened was for humanitarian aid to flow into Gaza and for people with dual citizenship to be able to leave Gaza, but not the mass of the residents there. And for a time, we had a standoff. That standoff has now ended. Humanitarian relief supplies are indeed entering Gaza, though so far only on a small scale. The Egyptians have won the standoff. The Israelis did not get a commitment from Egypt to allow a mass flow of Gazans into Egypt. So the Egyptians won that standoff. So far, the aid delivered has been on a very small scale, but we see President Biden committing the United States to work with Israel, obviously, to have the scale of humanitarian aid flowing into Gaza increased. And then, of course, there's this absolutely key sentence. They, that is to say Biden and al-Sisi, also discussed the importance of protecting civilian lives, respect for international humanitarian law, and ensuring that Palestinians in Gaza are not displaced to Egypt or any other nation. So, the United States has now accepted the Egyptian position that people from Gaza, the people of Gaza, residents from Gaza, are not going to go to Egypt to occupy 10 cities there, funded by Qatar to enable Israel to complete its military operation in Gaza. That idea has been abandoned. The Arab states were adamantly opposed to it. The King of Jordan, the President of Egypt, the President of the Palestinian Authority opposed it. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia also opposed it. The global community opposed it, the Russians opposed it, the Chinese opposed it, as I've discussed in many programs since the crisis began. Despite, shall we say, elliptical language on this issue used by the United States in the past, it is quite clear, at least to me, that the United States was initially supporting this Israeli proposal for people from Gaza to enter Egypt. Blinken proposed it to the Saudis and proposed it to President al-Sisi, and there was an extremely difficult and angry exchange between Blinken and al-Sisi, which the Egyptians in part videotaped, and in which al-Sisi was openly rude to Blinken in ways which I have discussed in previous programs. And it's fairly clear to me, incidentally, that in trying to lobby the Egyptians and other Arab governments to agree to this mass exodus of people from Gaza into Egypt, the United States was having support, was getting the support of some of its European allies. So the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, was also visiting the Middle East. He also had a meeting with the President of Egypt. I have little doubt that Chancellor Scholz was also trying to persuade President al-Sisi to open the crossing points to that end. Apparently, I haven't seen the video or read the readouts, but apparently al-Sisi was even more rude to Scholz than he had been to Blinken. So the Egyptians, backed by the Saudis and backed by the other Arab states, have slammed the door shut on that proposal. The United States has faced a united Arab world which proposed its resolution to the General Assembly. The Russians and the Brazilians had prepared the way in the Security Council. The Arab states took their resolution to the General Assembly. They showed again that they were united, and they got that resolution passed against the wishes of the United States. And note also how in this sentence, this American readout talks about the importance of protecting civilian lives and respect for international humanitarian law. And of course, these comments, ultimately, they are directed to Israel, because though this crisis initially began with an attack by Hamas on southern Israel, in which Hamas fighters killed civilians in Israel, at the present time, the majority of civilians who are being killed, the very great majority of civilians who are being killed in Gaza as a direct result of Israeli military action. So now we're told that protecting those civilians and showing respect for international humanitarian law is important, and that is in an American readout. And of course, that is a message to Israel. And what it is saying to Israel is indiscriminate bombing of Gaza. Of course, the Israelis will deny that that is happening, but indiscriminate bombing of Gaza, bombing of hospitals, that kind of thing. Actions of that kind, actions that violate international humanitarian law, are wrong, and logically, since this is also contrary to international humanitarian law, the blockade that Israel has imposed on Gaza, the denial of food and fuel and water supplies, that also really should end. And in fact, I have seen some reports, I don't know how much credence to place on them, that in fact there has been some slight easing of the blockade, and perhaps following this readout, we will see more steps being taken to that effect. But the key words again are those ruling out any displacement of the Palestinians from Gaza. And note that the readout says that the Palestinians in Gaza should not be displaced to Egypt or any other nation. Ideas of sending them to any other part of the Arab world, to Jordan perhaps, or wherever, that is unacceptable. I think that these words, not displaced to Egypt or any the Palestinians in Gaza should not be displaced to Egypt or any other nation. I think they might be interpreted as ruling out their displacement even to the West Bank, though I accept that that is one interpretation. A different interpretation could be that these words might even allow that. But anyway, for the moment, that there should be no displacement of the Palestinians from Gaza, that clearly is a concession to the Egyptians that the Americans have now been forced to make. And then we have further important words in this readout. The president briefed President Sisi. Actually, he should be President Al-Sisi. I don't quite know why the readout gets that wrong. But anyway, the president briefed President Sisi on US efforts to ensure that regional actors not expand the conflict in Gaza, and also on continuing efforts to secure the release of hostages. President Biden and President Sisi affirmed their commitment to work together to set the conditions for a durable and sustainable peace in the Middle East, to include the establishment of a Palestinian state. And again, two very interesting and very important sentences. So firstly, the president briefed President Sisi on US efforts to ensure that regional actors not expand the conflict in Gaza. So, United States assuring the Egyptians that the United States does not want a wider war in the Middle East and will strive to prevent one. This could be a further sign that the United States does not want to get itself involved in some kind of conflict with Iran. I have discussed how this enormous US military build-up, some of the language and rhetoric coming out not just out of Israel, but out of the United States also could be seen to be pointing towards such a conflict with Iran. I discussed in a recent program how some of the rhetoric, some of the actions taken by the United States, the airstrikes on Shia militia bases after rather mysterious, though undoubted attacks on American bases in Iraq and Syria, how the rhetoric, the language, some of the actions, all, for me, had some concerning resemblances to what happened at the time of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964. But anyway, we see nothing like that in this readout. On the contrary, the president here seems to be going out of his way to reassure President Al-Sisi that the United States does not actually want a larger war. And we also read that the United States will work to secure the release of the hostages. I do find, by the way, this discussion of the hostages very remarkable. The hostages, the vast majority of the hostages, are Israelis. There are some foreign nationals who have also been taken hostage by Hamas. But one would have, and some of the hostages apparently have American citizenship. One would have expected that the release of the hostages would be an American and Israeli priority. And yet we see that if one follows the structure and tone of this readout, discussion of the release of the hostages comes towards the end, as if this is somehow less important. And one almost gets the feel from reading this readout that it was President al-Sisi of Egypt who brought up the importance of getting the hostages released, and that it was not something that it was at the top of President Biden's mind. Now, that may be unfair. That may be that it's just the way the readout reads to me, and that, in fact, President Biden and his team are deeply concerned about the hostages. But I have to say, if that was the case, I would have thought that the issue, the question of the hostages, would be given more priority. And then we see the readout end with this commitment to work together to set the conditions for a durable and sustainable peace in the Middle East, to include the establishment of a Palestinian state. Now, again, in fairness to President Biden, since he became president, he's always rhetorically supported the setting up of a Palestinian state. He's not actually done anything at all as president to achieve that. He's talked about it again since this present crisis started on the 7th of October. Again, one can't see that very much to that effect has actually happened. But now, a General Assembly resolution has been passed, backed by all the Arab states, including historic US allies like Jordan, which actually apparently was the chief sponsor of the resolution, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and which is backed by other Muslim countries like Pakistan, for example, also historic allies of the United States. And we see that the president is now making a commitment to an Arab leader, President al-Sisi of Egypt, the leader of the biggest Arab state, that the United States from this moment on, this point onwards, is going to seek a durable and sustainable peace in the Middle East, to include the establishment of a Palestinian state. Rhetoric, we have heard, language we've seen from the Russians, from President Putin, from the Chinese, from Wang Yi, from the Saudis and other Arab leaders, but not so much, perhaps, from the Americans, and certainly not from the Israelis. It echoes closely the rhetoric of the resolutions the Russians and the Brazilians have proposed, and of course it also closely mirrors the ideas that have been floated by the Chinese and the Russians. Now, this is a very vague commitment. Nobody is going to be able to pin President Biden down to anything here. But a durable and sustainable peace in the Middle East, to include the establishment of a Palestinian state. At this time, that kind of language, again, shifts the balance towards the Arab position. Now, contrast this readout, the tone of this readout, with the much more aggressive tone of an earlier readout from last week of a conversation that took place on the 24th of October between Biden and MBS, the Crown Prince and Prime Minister of Saudi Arabia. And of course, Biden and MBS don't get on especially well. That's, I think, fairly well established. But it's clear from the language of the American readout of that call that at that time, the United States was in an altogether much more forceful and, dare I say it, aggressive move, aggressive in its support of Israel and its hostility to Hamas and in its desire to see the Israelis succeed in the ground operation that they were launching in Gaza, and also in their effort to, and perhaps in the larger effort, to push back or perhaps even defeat Iran. Now, consider the language of this readout. This is the readout that took place last week of the conversation between Biden and MBS. President Biden spoke today with Crown Prince and Prime Minister Mohammed bin Salman about the situation in the Middle East region. The President affirmed that the United States fully supports the defense of US partners facing terrorist threats, whether from state or non-state actors. So, the United States fully supports allies, US allies in the Middle East. Now, that could include Saudi Arabia, but it could also include, because it also includes Israel, when they face terrorist threats, whether from state or non-state actors. And of course, the reference to not a state actor clearly refers to Iran. And then he goes on, the readout goes on to say he discussed ongoing diplomatic and military efforts to deter state and non-state actors from widening the conflict between Israel and Hamas. So you see that in this other readout, the one of the conversation with MBS, President Biden is talking about US action to deter state and non-state actors. Deter state actors, again, refers to Iran, and of course we see the enormous build-up of military forces by the United States. And I've discussed in previous programs how this build-up goes far beyond deterrence. And indeed, going back again to my earlier programs, it looked to me as if much of the rhetoric about deterrence and self-defense seemed, if anything, to be pointing towards preemptive, as the US would say, preemptive military action against Iran. Now, there is one specific fact about this earlier readout, the one between Biden and MBS, which instantly sets it apart from the readout I've just discussed between Biden and al-Sisi. The readout between Biden and al-Sisi nowhere mentions Hamas. The word Hamas in that readout nowhere appears. Whereas, of course, in this earlier readout, the one discussing the conversation between the conversation between Biden and MBS, we see that there is a specific reference to Hamas. He discussed ongoing diplomatic efforts to deter state and non-state actors from widening the conflict between Israel and Hamas. In the other readout, it's the Palestinians. In this, the later readout, the one between Biden and al-Sisi, it's the Palestinians who get mentioned. In this readout, up to this point, it is Hamas. And then we read, the two leaders agreed on pursuing broader diplomatic efforts to maintain stability across the region and prevent the conflict from expanding. But this, of course, comes after the American warnings about deterrence. They welcomed the delivery of humanitarian assistance from Egypt into Gaza and recognized that much more is needed for civilians to have sustained access to food, water, and medical assistance. And then there is a discussion about humanitarian assistance being provided by the Gulf Cooperation Council, and Biden says that he is going to try and match that aid provided by the Gulf Cooperation Council. But note that there is no word about increasing the flow of aid, accelerating the delivery of aid. It's much more low-key. And then there is a mention of the hostages. Both leaders welcomed ongoing efforts to secure the release of hostages held by Hamas and called for their immediate release. And here again, we see a reference to Hamas again, which we didn't see in the later readout, but one of the discussion between Biden and al-Sisi. And then we have the comments about peace. They also affirm the importance of working towards a sustainable peace between Israelis and Palestinians as soon as the crisis subsides, building on the work that was already underway between Saudi Arabia and the United States over recent months. Now notice here the omission, because of course in the readout of the conversation between al-Sisi and Biden, there is a clear, straightforward, clear-cut reference to the establishment of a Middle East state. President Biden and President Sisi affirmed their commitment to work together to set the conditions for a durable and sustainable peace in the Middle East, to include the establishment of a Palestinian state. The readout of the conversation between Biden and MBS does not refer to a Palestinian state. They also affirmed the importance of working towards a sustainable peace between Israelis and Palestinians as soon as the crisis subsides. No reference to a Palestinian state. Building on the work that was already underway between Saudi Arabia and the United States over recent months. So what Biden was actually talking about was not setting up a Palestinian state. He was trying to persuade MBS to work again on this American proposal for Saudi Arabia and Israel to normalize relations, establish diplomatic relations with each other, and move forward with that in return for the United States looking the other way as Saudi Arabia pursues its nuclear weapons program and all of those things. And supposedly this was going to lead to some kind of a sustainable peace, but it was completely unclear how. Well, now Biden is talking not just about a sustainable peace, but a durable and sustainable peace. In other words, a long-term peace, one which will resolve this conflict once and for all. And he's promising al-Sisi that it will be via the establishment of a Palestinian state. So, we can see how much things have changed over the course of the last week. And we can also see how the diplomatic efforts that have been underway between the various parties, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Arab states, all of them working together, the Brazilians, of course, also, the other BRIC states, the countries of the Global South, the ASEAN states, which also made their own statement calling for the establishment of a Palestinian state. We have seen how all of that coming together resulting in that vote in the General Assembly has, to some extent at least, concentrated minds, so that President Biden, in speaking to President al-Sisi, even according to the American readouts, is having to moderate his language and make commitments, public commitments, different from what perhaps he would have wanted to make. Note that in that conversation, that readout of the conversation with MBS, there is no mention, or as there is in the readout of the conversation with al-Sisi, that there should not be, that the Palestinians in Gaza should not be displaced to Egypt or any other nation. The earlier readout contains nothing of that nature, but the latest readout does. So we can see that the doors have been slamming, the diplomatic doors have been slamming in the United States' face. It has suffered a political defeat in the General Assembly. It senses that the tide of world opinion is starting to shift, and shift in unfavorable ways. It is probably, the US government is probably also aware that there is now growing dissension within the Democratic Party over this matter within the United States, and that congressional staffers are apparently unhappy, and also some people in the State Department are also said to be unhappy. I have said many times that the United States, even this administration, cannot just ignore these sort of pressures, these sort of diplomatic pressures. We see that even in Europe, support has been splintering. France voting for that General Assembly resolution, and we see that it is starting to have an effect. And it is having an effect on the ground, because putting aside the question of whether or not the blockade on Gaza has indeed been eased, we now hear more and more about the fact that the fighting in Gaza is going to be protracted. I saw a report somewhere, I think I discussed it in my program yesterday, that there's talk about this conflict in Gaza going on for a whole year. The United States, Israel, trying to clamp down on information about what is going on in Gaza. They don't want a whole year of bad photographs and pictures and headlines of buildings being hit by bombs, of civilians being killed, of hospitals having to be evacuated. There's been reports that Israel has called for the Al-Quds hospital, which I understand they claim is located above the bunker in which Hamas's headquarters are located. I have no way of knowing whether that one is true or not. Anyway, they've apparently called for that particular hospital to be evacuated from its location. Anyway, all of that, the United States and Israel, understanding how much damage all of these pictures have done, they want to clamp on circulation of that information, and they want to try and keep that clampdown going for the year or more that they think this conflict will last. Now, whether they're going to be able to achieve that is, of course, an entirely different matter. I was reading in the Daily Telegraph, of all places, that around 100,000 people are now regularly protesting against the Israeli bombing of Gaza in London. I don't know whether that is true or not. I haven't seen many reports about these protests, but I do understand that they are large. I understand that there are protests going on in the United States. And of course, protests in the Arab and Muslim world are escalating. Now, there was a protest, a violent protest, in one particular location where protests of this nature continue to be deeply embarrassing. especially embarrassing to the government. And this was the protest that took place in Dagestan, when reports circulated on Telegram, and there's been links to one particular Telegram channel, which was apparently very active in circulating these stories, and links that have been apparently point to this particular Telegram channel being run from Kiev. I saw that the Financial Times, no less, acknowledged that this was the case, and acknowledged that this particular Telegram channel had been set up by Ilya Ponomaryov, who is a Russian politician, very much in conflict with President Putin and his government, and that anyway, there were reports that it was this particular channel that played the leading role in inspiring these protests in Dagestan. Now, it was these Telegram channels that were responsible for this. This is not, by the way, entirely surprising. The Ukrainian government has been trying to create problems for the Russians in the Northern Caucasus throughout the period of the special military operation, which is entirely unsurprising. The Russians had to fight a very prolonged and very difficult war in the Northern Caucasus, firstly against the Chechen independence movement, they would say the Chechen separatist movement, and of course against the jihadi fighters who eventually launched their own insurgency, piggybacking off that Chechen separatist or independence movement. The Russians eventually prevailed in that conflict. Most of the local people sided with them in the end. So did the political leaders of these regions. So, by the way, did most of the religious leaders also in the end. But, of course, this remains a region about which the Russians are concerned. And, of course, anyway, and beyond that, as I've discussed in the past, the Russian government has to take into account the feelings of the large Muslim community in Russia, which accounts for, I believe, between 10 and 20% of the population of Russia. They have to take that into account, and they have to take into account especially the feelings of the Chechen fighters and the other fighters from the Northern Caucasus who are playing a very important role in the war against Ukraine in the area of the special military operation. So the Russians can't afford to just disregard all of that, and of course they're not doing so. So the Russians are deeply embarrassed by this, but of course they're embarrassed by other things. They're also deeply embarrassed, by any displays of hostility to the Jewish community in Russia. Russia still has an important Jewish community. The Russian authorities are very conscious of the complex and difficult history of relations between previous Russian governments and the Jewish people. The word pogrom, of course, connects to anti-Jewish movements, actions, violent actions, which took place in Russia in the lead up to the revolution in the late 19th and early 20th century. They don't want the world to think that those kind of sentiments still exist in Russia. So these protests that took place in Dagestan are, for the Russian authorities, an extremely sensitive issue. And the trigger were reports circulated by these Telegram channels, which do seem to have been connected to Ukraine. Certainly the Financial Times appears to think so. These protests were triggered by reports that an aircraft coming to The main airport in Dagestan from Tel Aviv was coming with Jewish refugees who would presumably have been allowed to settle in Dagestan. And these reports, and I have no doubt at all the work of some local agitators, managed to get several hundred people to occupy the airport and to intimidate and frighten passengers. And there was shops were looted and a fair amount of damage was done. And there's reports now that a police officer who was participated in the operation which cleared these protesters from the airport, that one particular officer has now died as a result of injuries which were inflicted as this protest was eventually brought under control. Now, there's been some criticism of the Russian authorities about the way in which the protest was handled. I think that the authorities would have wanted to act with great circumspection, knowing perfectly well the strong feelings of Muslim believers in the Northern Caucasus and the recent history of the wars there. They do not want to be seen taking violent action to suppress a protest which might have resulted in large numbers of people being killed. And that will have influenced the way in which this protest was brought under control. But the leaders of Dagestan, the political and religious leaders of Dagestan, have been outspoken. They've condemned this protest in the strongest terms. Putin is going to chair a meeting in Moscow connected to it. The chief of the investigative committee, Russia's equivalent to the FBI, a man called Bystrykhin, has been put in personal charge of the investigation. And there's talk that some of those men who participated in that protest and who are of military age, that they might even be drafted into the Russian armed forces and packed off to fight in the conflict in Ukraine. Though whether that is a good idea and whether that will actually happen remains to be seen. Anyway, that of course was one protest amongst many, and it had its distinct features, but that there have been many protests around the Muslim world connected to these events, that is indisputable. We see some extraordinary rhetoric pouring out of Turkey, for example, including on the part of President Erdogan. And obviously, the Western powers, the United States, cannot simply disregard it. Now, in my program yesterday, I discussed other diplomatic action which the US president is taking. He's had a 1-hour meeting, it turns out, with Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, and Wang Yi has also had extensive meetings over the course of a 3-day visit to Washington with the US Secretary of State, Tony Blinken. And based on the Chinese readout, Wang Yi also had a rather tetchy and difficult meeting with Jake Sullivan, the President Biden's national security advisor. Now, I'm going to say briefly that reading the Chinese readout of the discussion between Biden and Wang Yi, I sort of came away with the impression that Biden did at least try to convey the impression that he was sorry for some of the things he has said in the past about Xi Jinping. And if so, that would be understandable, because it is clear that the overriding purpose of these meetings, which, to be very clear, have been pushed for most by the Americans, is to try to get this summit meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping set up in San Francisco next month. Now, I'd assumed when I covered these discussions in my program yesterday that there had been, in effect, an agreement to that effect. And US reports today suggest that there is an agreement, that there will be a summit meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping in November in San Francisco. I have to say that Wang Yi's comments since the meeting suggest otherwise. Wang Yi seems to be a lot less confident that there should be a meeting, that there will be a meeting between the Americans and between Biden and Xi Jinping. He has said, for example, this is Wang Yi, that it won't be smooth sailing to set up this meeting. And there's even been a statement by the Chinese Foreign Ministry which said that the meeting, that there were still many issues to be resolved. Both sides believe that it is both beneficial and necessary for the United States and China to maintain dialogue, but the overall sense is that there continue to be problems. And Wang Yi is also reported to have said that the United States and China must eliminate interference, overcome obstacles, establish consensus, and accumulate results. And there's been a editorial in Global Times which essentially confirms this, that this is the Chinese position, that the fact that there will be a summit meeting should not be taken for granted. The editorial reads, at least in part, China and the US still face many uncertainties in further promoting high-level interactions and stabilizing bilateral relations. Whenever there is an opportunity for improvement in China-US relations, or even one or even several hidden arrows will be shot from somewhere within the United States, hijacking and undermining China-US relations with absurd political logic. And then he talks about the balloon incident, and then the editorial said, China and the US are standing at a new crossroads, and there are increasingly more voices in the United States from the business, intellectual, and policy circles calling for a rational view of China. In this context, how to eliminate those hidden arrows and integrate into the efforts to stabilize and improve China-US relations as soon as possible tests Washington's political courage and foresight. So it is not certain that there will be a summit. I think that there will nonetheless be a summit. I think for the Chinese to decide that there won't be a summit, for Xi Jinping not to go now to San Francisco and to meet Biden there, would, after all these efforts and all this time that both sides have invested into this process, be such a slamming of the door in the face of the United States that it would risk putting the entire relationship between the United States and China into a potentially disastrous and uncontrolled tailspin. Be very difficult to see how relations between Biden and Xi Jinping could be repaired in the event of that. And of course, the Chinese have to consider that if Biden is re-elected next year, which of course still remains possible, then by acting in this way, by slamming the door in Biden's face, China might be jeopardizing its prospects of improving its relations with the United States for a further 5 years. So I think a meeting will take place. I don't think that it will lead to any major changes or results. I think what the Chinese are more intending to do is to reach out to those business, intellectual, and policy circles which call for a rational view of China. In other words, Xi Jinping will be wanting to meet more people in the United States than Biden himself, and that they might be looking for people from business and intellectual and policy circles. People like, well, Tim Cook, the head of Apple, Elon Musk, others like that, who knows whom, and also intellectuals and people in the academic community, that kind of thing, in a hope that in some way, once this particular administration has left the scene, something can start to be built up again. Whether that is a realistic prospect, frankly, I rather doubt. But I think overall that we will get a summit, and I suspect that that is the Chinese objective. Anyway, it's clear that one topic that the Chinese did not want to discuss in any detail in Washington was the issue of Ukraine. They didn't talk about this. China is boycotting this latest meeting of people, countries that the Americans are putting together in Malta to talk about a settlement of the crisis in Ukraine. The Chinese at the moment are hosting the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu in Beijing, where he's attending a military conference. That relationship remains extremely strong. And of course it is doing so, even as the military situation, the Russian military situation in Ukraine is becoming stronger, and Ukraine's military situation is deteriorating. Now, there hasn't been very much more news about the military situation in Ukraine over the last 24 hours that supplements in any great detail the various points that I made yesterday. Suffice to say that Russian reports continue to speak of progress in the Avdiivka area, and there are now increasing reports of a crisis in the relationship between President Zelensky and General Zaluzhny, with Zaluzhny apparently, according to Ukrainian reports, demanding an urgent meeting, not just with Zelensky, but with all other military and civilian commanders and leaders in Kiev to discuss where the events are going and what to do about Avdiivka, which is rapidly becoming an operational crisis. And there are also reports that the General Zaluzhny and other Ukrainian officials are beginning now to become extremely concerned that even as the situation in the Avdiivka area is deteriorating, and deteriorating much faster, I suspect, than anyone imagined, the same arguably is happening in the Kupiansk area, where information is even more sketchy, but where I'm getting more and more reports of very heavy Ukrainian casualties, of Ukrainian positions being captured one by one, and of the Russians working their way towards some kind of envelopment. Now, again, I don't know that this is all true, but I've seen reports to that effect. So, all of this happening alongside increasing problems in other respects. More Ukrainian attempts have been made to launch missiles towards Crimea. Apparently these were made principally Storm Shadow and Scout missiles. The Russians claim that they shot down every one. There are more reports of the Russians shooting down more ATACMS missiles. They claim to have shot down 4 in the last ATACMS strike. Supposedly, of course, we don't have confirmation from the Ukrainians about this, but fewer and fewer of the ATACMS missiles are getting through. Perhaps none of them are. We've had the devastating losses experienced by the Ukrainian Air Force, and there's now some news from the Kherson front as well. Now, Ukraine has been trying to send Marines across the Dnieper River into the East Bank of the Dnieper in Kherson region. They're clinging on to some houses in a small village there called Kirki, apparently protected to some extent by the bad weather. There's been complaints within Russia that this has been allowed to happen. And the news that's come through yesterday is that General Templinsky, the overall commander of Russia's airborne forces, his paratroopers, the man who carried out a virtuosic defense of Kherson city and of Kherson, on the west bank of the Dnieper during the Ukrainian offensive last year, the man who is widely considered to be amongst Russia's best battlefield commanders, has now taken command of Russian troops on the east bank of the Dnieper in Kherson region. Undoubtedly, one of his tasks will be to clear the Ukrainians from the east bank entirely. But I have to also say that the appointment of such a important and popular commander might also imply that something more aggressive is on the way. And I recall that people like Sladko, the governor of Kherson region, the Russian-appointed governor of Kherson region, have claimed in the past that there is a Russian plan to reoccupy Kherson region west of the Dnieper. Well, most probably, Templinsky's appointment is to shore up the defences on the east bank rather than take that aggressive action. But there are basically 4 Ukrainian Marine brigades on the west bank of the Dnieper who are supposed to be carrying out this offensive. This is a relatively small force for an offensive of this nature, and these brigades have already been badly damaged in the ultimately unsuccessful offensive that they tried to carry out in the Vremivka salient area. And if the Russians, whose forces are growing in size and strength all the time, make the decision in the winter that the time has come for them to launch an offensive in this area themselves, then arguably Templinsky might be the right person to do this. Now, all these points about what Templinsky might do, let me stress, these are all pure speculations. I do remember those comments by Sladko. We'll see, however, what he does. But anyway, given that the operation in Kherson is the only place at the moment where the Ukrainians can claim any sort of success, the arrival of Templinsky must for them be concerning. So, a major crisis for Ukraine developing on the conflict area. They must be increasingly worried, well, they are clearly worried about weakening Western support if Israel is going to be involved in a 1-year war in Gaza. That inevitably is going to mean that the bulk of Western weapons, American weapons, are going to go to Israel, not to Ukraine. And I would add also at this point that Mike Johnson, the new Speaker of the House, though he continues to talk about, though he's now talking about continued support for Ukraine, it's quite clear that he is prioritizing support for Israel. So bad news for Ukraine, a more confident mood all the time, from what I can judge, in Moscow, at least where the war is concerned, and a significant shift in the American position over the Middle East. Well, perhaps this is the moment, today is the day, when the great crisis in the Middle East is going to start to abate We shall see. And of course, in Ukraine, it seems to me that the situation grinds on towards its now inevitable conclusion. But this is where I end this video for today. There'll be more from me soon, obviously. Remember, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, local, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget also to check out our shop, where you will find all the amazing things that we have there, our magic mugs, hats, hoods, hoodies, t-shirts, all those things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.